Nobody expected the Strait of Hormuz crisis to start changing the balance of power this way. For weeks, most of the world has been looking at the same map, the same shipping lanes, the same oil price spikes, and reaching the same conclusion. If one of the most important waterways on Earth is being squeezed, then the outcome will be decided by the usual powers, the United States, the Gulf, monarchies, maybe Iran itself. But that is only the surface of the story. Because underneath the headlines, another country, one that was never supposed to matter in this theater, may be emerging as the one actor with the most relevant experience in the entire crisis. And that is what makes this moment so dangerous and so strategically important. This is not just a story about tankers, energy markets, or a regional standoff spinning out of control. It is a story about what happens when a country that survived one of the most punishing maritime pressure campaigns in modern war starts turning that experience into exportable power. It is a story about what happens when survival becomes expertise, when expertise becomes leverage, and when leverage begins to redraw relationships far beyond the original battlefield. This story has three layers. The first is the blockade itself, and why the Strait of Hormuz is far more than a narrow strip of water on the map. The second is another theater of war, where a very similar strategy was used to choke a country's economy and force it toward submission. And the third is the layer that matters most, the moment when the country that learned how to live through that pressure also learned how to break it, adapt it, and potentially help others do the same. Once you connect all three, this stops looking like a temporary regional emergency. It starts looking like the early stage of a much bigger geopolitical shift. Now let's start with the crisis itself, because before we talk about strategy adaptation or shifting alliances, we need to understand why the Strait of Hormuz matters so much in the first place. This is not just another tense waterway in a volatile region. It is one of the most important strategic choke points in the global economy. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil trade and a major share of its liquefied natural gas move through this narrow passage. That means when traffic through Hormuz is disrupted, the consequences do not stay in the Gulf. They ripple outward almost immediately into shipping costs, energy prices, industrial supply chains, and national budgets thousands of miles away. That is why this crisis has drawn so much attention so quickly. The moment commercial shipping began to face sustained danger, markets reacted. Analysts started warning about supply shocks. Governments across Asia began watching the strait with a level of anxiety that went far beyond normal regional concern. For countries that depend heavily on imported energy, this is not a distant military drama. It is a direct threat to economic stability. A disruption here can raise fuel costs, squeeze manufacturing, increase inflation, and put pressure on political leaders who have no control over the waters where the crisis began. And that is what makes the Strait of Hormuz different from most regional flashpoints. This is not a battlefield that matters only to the countries surrounding it. It is a pressure valve for the global system. When it tightens, everyone feels it, from energy importing economies in Asia to financial markets in Europe and beyond. A narrow strip of water suddenly becomes one of the most important pieces of real estate on Earth, not because of its size, but because of what the modern world still needs to move through it every single day. But there is another reason this crisis matters, and it is the one that often gets lost behind the headlines about oil prices and military deployments. A blockade or even a partial disruption in a place like Hormuz is not just an economic event. It is a strategic message. It tells the world that shipping lanes can be turned into leverage, that geography can be weaponized, and that control over trade routes can become a form of coercion, just as powerful as missiles or aircraft. And once you understand that the current crisis starts looking less like an isolated emergency and more like a familiar pattern, because the world has seen this logic before in another war, in another body of water, and the comparison is more important than it first appears. To understand why that pattern matters so much, we need to go back to another body of water, the Black Sea, because long before the Strait of Hormuz became the center of a global energy shock, another maritime choke point had already been turned into a weapon. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, One of its most effective early moves was not only on land, it was at sea. Moscow moved to restrict access to Ukraine's ports, squeeze commercial traffic, and turn maritime pressure into economic punishment. The goal was not complicated. Cut the country off from trade, weaken its revenue, and increase the cost of resistance until the pressure became unbearable. And for a time that strategy worked. Ukraine is one of the world's major agricultural exporters. Grain, food supplies, and maritime trade were not side issues for the Ukrainian economy. They were vital arteries. Once those arteries were constricted, the damage spread far beyond the coastline. It hit state revenue. It hit export capacity. It hit global food markets. It hit countries far from the battlefield that depended on Ukrainian shipments. In other words, the Black Sea blockade was never just a military maneuver. It was an attempt to turn geography into economic force and economic force into political leverage. That is the comparison that matters now. Because the logic behind a maritime squeeze is always bigger than the ships involved. It is about control over movement. It is about forcing entire economies to absorb pressure they did not choose and cannot easily escape. And that is exactly why the Strait of Hormuz crisis feels so familiar when viewed through this lens. The names are different, the region is different, the commodities are different, but the underlying method is strikingly similar. Restrict a critical route, raise the cost for everyone downstream, and hope the economic pain creates strategic advantage. But here is where the story becomes much more important than a simple historical comparison. Most countries can recognize a blockade after it starts. Very few know how to survive one, adapt under it, and eventually make it fail. Ukraine had to learn that the hard way. It was not studying this as theory. It was living it in real time with its economy, its exports, and its wartime survival on the line. And that is why Ukraine matters so much in this story. Not because it is geographically closest to Hormuz, not because it is the biggest military actor in the region, but because it may be the one country involved in the broader conversation that has already been forced to solve a version of this exact problem under the pressure of an actual war. And that is where Ukraine's answer becomes so important. Because recognizing the pattern of a blockade is one thing, breaking it is something else entirely. When Russia moved to dominate the Black Sea, Ukraine did not have the kind of conventional naval power needed to challenge that pressure head-on. It did not have a fleet that could simply sail out, win sea control, and reopen trade by brute force, under a traditional military logic that should have left Ukraine trapped. A stronger power had the ships, the reach, and the positional advantage. Ukraine had to find a different way to fight. What it found was an asymmetric answer, and that answer changed the war. Instead of trying to match Russia ship for ship, Ukraine began making the cost of maritime control harder and harder to sustain. Long-range strikes, precision attacks, and above all, unmanned naval systems started rewriting the terms of the contest. Ukraine did not need to destroy every vessel in the Black Sea. It only needed to make Russian naval presence dangerous enough, expensive enough, and uncertain enough that the blockade could no longer function the way it had in the opening phase of the war. That shift matters because it reveals a larger truth about modern conflict. Control is not only about who has the bigger platform, it is about who can make that platform vulnerable. And that is exactly what Ukraine learned to do. Cheap systems, creative doctrine, and battlefield adaptation allowed a country with limited traditional naval strength to challenge one of the most intimidating maritime forces in the region. Over time, that pressure changed behavior. It forced repositioning. It narrowed freedom of movement. And most importantly, it helped reopen space for commercial activity that had once looked permanently shut down. That is the lesson the world should pay attention to now. Ukraine did not solve the Black Sea crisis by becoming stronger in the old sense. It solved it by making old assumptions less useful. It turned innovation into deterrence and deterrence into access. In other words, it found a way to impose costs without needing symmetrical power. And once that kind of lesson exists in the real world, it does not stay confined to one battlefield for long. Because the moment another region faces a similar pressure campaign, the question changes. It is no longer just how dangerous the blockade is. It becomes whether someone already knows how to make that blockade fail. And that is why the story does not end in the Black Sea. Because once a country proves that a blockade can be challenged Without matching a larger power ship for ship, other governments start paying attention. What Ukraine developed was not just a collection of tactics for one war. It was a workable model for surviving maritime pressure, protecting trade under threat, and using lower-cost systems to complicate an opponent's entire strategy. And in a crisis built around a strategic waterway, that kind of experience becomes incredibly valuable. This is where the Strait of Hormuz story begins to change shape. The countries most exposed to prolonged disruption in the Gulf do not simply need more concern, more statements, or more diplomatic theater. They need a method. They need practical answers to questions that have suddenly become urgent. How do you keep critical traffic moving under threat? How do you raise the cost of harassment at sea? How do you defend economic lifelines when the pressure is designed to drain you slowly, rather than destroy you all at once? Those are not abstract policy questions. They are wartime questions in economic form. And Ukraine now sits in a rare position. It is one of the few countries in the world that has recent, direct, battle-tested experience dealing with exactly this kind of coercive pressure. That matters because what is being transferred here is bigger than hardware. It is doctrine. It is operational logic. It is the accumulated knowledge of what worked, what failed, what scaled, and what changed the behavior of a stronger adversary over time. In a situation like this that may be more valuable than any single weapons shipment. That is also why the emerging relationships around this crisis matter so much. If countries in the Gulf begin drawing on Ukrainian expertise, they are not just buying equipment. They are buying a way of thinking about maritime defense in the age of asymmetric warfare. They are buying lessons written under real pressure by a country that had to learn quickly or pay the price in national survival. And once that kind of knowledge starts moving from one theater to another, the crisis stops being only about reopening a waterway. It becomes the beginning of a strategic transfer, one that could reshape who gets trusted, who gets consulted, and who becomes relevant in the next phase of the conflict. But even that is only part of the story. Because the deeper significance of this transfer is not just that Ukraine has something useful to teach. It is that the knowledge now moving through the region was forged in response to a system that Iran itself helped build somewhere else. And that is where the story takes its sharpest turn. Because this is no longer just about Ukraine having useful experience to share. It is about where that experience came from, and why that makes the current moment so strategically unsettling for Iran. The systems Ukraine was forced to study, endure, and counter did not emerge in a vacuum. They were shaped in part by the broader military relationship that linked Iran to the war against Ukraine in the first place. That is what gives this entire development its deeper meaning. The knowledge now moving toward the Gulf was not built in isolation. It was forged in reaction to pressure technology and tactics that Iran helped push into the war. That is what makes this a strategic inversion rather than a simple partnership story. Iran helped expand a model of pressure that relied on low-cost systems, persistent harassment, and the use of asymmetric tools to impose costs on a weaker opponent. Ukraine then spent years doing more than just surviving that pressure. It studied it, it adapted to it, it learned how to blunt it, disrupt it, and lower the cost of defending against it. And now, in one of the most important waterways on Earth, that hard-earned knowledge may be helping other states prepare for a similar kind of coercion. The logic has flipped. What once generated leverage is now generating counter-leverage. That reversal matters because it changes how power moves. In the old version of the story, pressure flowed in one direction. Iran and its partners could help shape the tools of intimidation, and others would be forced to absorb the cost. In the emerging version, that same cycle begins to work against its original architects. The methods that once created fear are studied until they become familiar. Once they become familiar, they become easier to counter. And once they become easier to counter, they stop producing the same political effect. The weapon does not disappear. Its advantage does. That may be the most important hidden layer in this entire crisis. Not simply that Ukraine has relevant expertise, but that its expertise was produced by direct exposure to the very kind of pressure now destabilizing the Gulf. In other words, Iran helped create the conditions that made Ukraine valuable to the states, now looking for answers. That does not just add irony to the story, it changes the strategic balance inside it. Because once a coercive model starts teaching others how to defeat itself, it is no longer expanding power the way it was meant to. It is slowly teaching the region how to resist it. And that is why this crisis may end up being about much more than shipping lanes or short-term deterrence. It may become the moment when battlefield adaptation starts turning into geopolitical influence, and when a country once seen primarily as a recipient of aid begins to emerge as a supplier of relevant power in a region far beyond its own war. But this is where the story grows beyond tactics, countermeasures, or even the Strait of Hormuz itself. Because once battlefield adaptation begins moving across regions, it does more than solve an immediate crisis. It starts changing who matters, and that may be the most consequential development taking shape here. Ukraine is no longer appearing only as a country asking for aid weapons or diplomatic support. It is beginning to appear as a country that can provide something other states genuinely need: recent usable battle-proven knowledge about how to survive pressure from a stronger adversary and how to turn that survival into leverage. That shift has real geopolitical weight. In international politics, relevance is not determined only by size, wealth, or geography home. It is also determined by usefulness. Countries become more important when they can offer capabilities, insight, or solutions that others cannot easily find elsewhere. That is exactly the kind of space Ukraine may now be entering. Not because the war at home is over, and not because its own vulnerabilities have disappeared, but because years of forced adaptation have produced a form of expertise that travels in a world shaped by strategic choke points, drone warfare, economic coercion, and unstable deterrence. That kind of expertise has value far beyond Eastern Europe, and the implications do not stop with Ukraine. For the Gulf states, drawing on that knowledge is not just a short-term response to a shipping crisis. It is a sign of how seriously they are taking the possibility that maritime pressure, low-cost harassment, and asymmetric disruption could become the defining security problem of the region for years to come. A country does not seek out this kind of hard-earned wartime doctrine unless it believes the old assumptions are no longer enough. That alone tells you something important. The region is not only reacting to a crisis, it may already be adjusting to a new security reality. That is where the balance begins to shift. If Ukraine becomes a trusted source of relevant military knowledge in the Gulf, then influence begins moving with that trust. Consultation leads to cooperation. Cooperation can lead to defense ties, technology, sharing, long-term planning, and eventually a different map of strategic relationships. And when that happens, someone else's influence starts to weaken. Because every new partnership built on real utility is also a reminder that prestige alone is not enough anymore. What matters is who can still solve problems under pressure. That is why this moment should be understood as more than a tactical adjustment inside one crisis. It is the early outline of a position shift. A country that many outsiders still see only through the lens of vulnerability is beginning to acquire another identity, one tied to competence, relevance, and exportable strategic value. And once that happens, the story is no longer just about whether a blockade can be challenged. It becomes about who the wider region starts taking seriously from this point forward. And that is the real story hiding underneath this crisis. Not simply that a major waterway is under pressure, and not simply that one wartime innovation is being discussed in another region. The deeper story is that modern conflict no longer rewards only the countries with the biggest fleets, the deepest arsenals, or the longest established influence. More and more, it rewards the countries that learn fastest, under pressure, adapt faster than expected, and turn survival into something other states can actually use. That is what makes this moment so significant. Ukraine entered the war as the country many assumed would spend years reacting, absorbing damage, and depending almost entirely on outside help. But wars do not only destroy, they also reveal. They expose which states can improvise, which can scale hard lessons into doctrine, and which can transform battlefield necessity into strategic relevance. That process does not erase vulnerability, but it can create a new kind of power, one built less on mass and more on demonstrated competence. And that may be the most uncomfortable implication for Iran and for any state that relies heavily on coercive pressure as a political instrument. The more often that pressure is used, the more likely it is to be studied, decoded, and eventually countered by the very actors it was meant to intimidate. Once that happens, coercion starts eroding itself. The model still exists, the threat still exists, the weapons still exist, but the advantage starts to thin out. What once looked like leverage begins teaching others how to resist leverage more cheaply and more effectively than before. That is why this story should not be read only as a chapter in the Hormuz crisis. It should be read as an example of how geopolitical influence is increasingly being redistributed, not only by wealth or firepower, but by who can convert lived wartime experience into systems, partnerships, and useful knowledge. In that kind of environment, the line between victim and strategic actor starts to blur. A country can still be under attack and yet become more relevant abroad. It can still be fighting for survival and yet begin shaping the security calculations of regions far from its own borders. And once that becomes possible, the old map of power starts to look less stable than it did before. Because the countries that matter most in the next phase of global conflict may not be the ones that look strongest at the beginning. They may be the ones that proved they could learn the fastest when the pressure was greatest. So, here is where things stand. The Strait of Hormuz remains a live crisis. The pressure on shipping, energy markets, and regional security has not disappeared. The immediate danger is still real, and the wider consequences are still unfolding. But even before this story reaches its final outcome, something important has already changed. What looked at first like another regional emergency is now revealing a broader shift in who carries relevant knowledge, who can offer practical answers under pressure, and who the wider region may increasingly turn to when the old assumptions stop working. That is why this story matters far beyond the Gulf, because it is not only about whether a blockade can be challenged or whether a waterway can be stabilized. It is about how war reshapes credibility, how pressure can create unexpected competence, and how states that begin a conflict in a position of vulnerability can emerge from it with a very different kind of influence. In that sense, this may end up being remembered not only as a crisis over trade routes and deterrence, but as one of those rare moments when the global map of strategic relevance begins to shift in plain sight even before most of the world has fully noticed.